Welcome everybody to week 8. This week we're going to discuss data analytics and the impact that it has on both supply chains as well as reverse logistics and the closed loop supply chain processes. So to give you a big picture on what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk about what analytics actually is. Really big nebulous term these days. We're going to kind of button it down and give you a big picture on it. We're going to talk about why analytics is so important, particularly in the supply chain, a couple of industry examples that'll really tie everything together. And then the relevance of analytics to reverse supply chains and closing that loop, and wondering whether or not analytics themselves can actually help to close the loop. Then we're going to summarize things up, and I'm going to leave you with a few discussions for you to think about. You'd be hard-pressed to find an industry where someone hasn't talked about analytics, at least in the past 5 years. And interestingly enough, if you talk to 5 different consultants, I think you'd get 5 different answers about what analytics actually is. So for the following discussion, just keep in mind, we're going to zone in on what analytics is as it applies to supply chain. And there's going to be a little bit of crossover to marketing, but mostly in the domain of supply chain, and then we're going to tie it to reverse logistics. So when you look out there and you try to understand what exactly it is, Accenture did a study among all the other big consulting firms. One of the interesting things they found was that 97% of executives report having an understanding, a big picture idea on how analytics and big data analytics can help the supply chain, but only 17% actually report having implemented it. So it's kind of like the elephant in the room everybody knows about, we got to take a hand on, but only 17% of people actually doing it. And why do you think that is? A lot of different reasons it could be, but what actually is it, right? I think that's the biggest driving force to the problem, is because it sounds like this fascinating, exciting thing, but what exactly does it mean? So when we bring it back into the context, supply chain analytics, what it involves is, and this is Capgemini, so they say that supply chain analytics aims to improve operational efficiency and effectiveness by enabling data-driven decisions at strategic and operational and tactical levels. So that's kind of interesting. So what they're saying that analytics is, it's taking data and leveraging it to make decisions at all 3 levels. But to me, that's kind of what we've been doing, right? We've always leveraged data in some way. Why analytics? Is it the same thing rebranded? Well, I think Deloitte actually takes that definition and extends it a bit, and they make the connection between ERP and analytics, which is even more interesting. And now we're starting to understand why analytics is so important. So the net, and this was an interview with one of their principal consultants. By the way, at the end of this slide, you'll see all the links, and they should be on the syllabus as well for you to take a look at, to the white papers. But what Deloitte is saying is that the transition from these older systems with the predecessors to ERP, now that we have ERP, it's significantly easy to store and gather all this data about their operations. And so now there's these dramatic shifts from capturing historical data and leveraging it into predictive insights. So rather than having a repository that just sits there and we acknowledge it's taking up disk space, now we can look at a way in order to leverage that predictive power of that historical data. And the whole goal, okay, and this is why I kind of like the Deloitte definition, is that we're looking to improve forecasts, we're looking to improve demand planning, sourcing, production, and distribution. But interestingly, what's missing from that, right? It's the reverse. Not a lot of people are really discussing yet analytics in the reverse supply chain, but it's vitally important. So when you think about the supply chain in and of itself, by now I think we have at least a good working definition of what it is. We commonly refer to the supply chain as all the entities involved with the sourcing, production, storage, distribution, requisition of products from end to end, right? That's the supply chain. When you think about how business has transitioned away from completely vertically integrated to a more outsource driven model, the stakeholders grow exponentially, because it's not necessarily just that we have to worry about from whom are we purchasing, it's tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and so on. So that's a big part of it. The growing amount of stakeholders, you got to understand what's going on and what the demand patterns are. Then you've got to think about the impact that supply chain integration has had. So at first it was MRP, just integrating what resources we need with what the demand's going to be. Then it moved on to MRP2, and then electronic data interchange. And now ERP really is kind of an end-to-end visibility on the whole system. So what this means is, and this is kind of what Deloitte alluded to, So when we gradually move on to these fully integrated systems, our technological capabilities necessarily increase. When those technological capabilities increase, what we're seeing is better, more importantly, and larger data collection abilities. So we can capture information now, for example, on the click-through rates of online advertising. We can capture data on the cost per 1,000 users. We can capture data on the frequency with which people visit our site. And so this is kind of an online marketing perspective that connects into the supply chain, as we're going to show you in a couple examples. But now we're getting better and more sophisticated data. But then you have to ask yourself the question, what do we do with it all? So a lot of analytics tends to go down the way of data mining. These algorithmic approaches to sifting through the data and figuring out what's happening. A great example I read recently was pairing up of Diet Mountain Dew with hot dogs at a gas station. This was actually not recently, but it was relevant. And so the idea was that they had this whole data set of the mini marts of these gas stations, and for whatever reason, there was a significantly high volume and a correlation. It wasn't a causation, it was a correlation between people purchasing hot dogs from the counter and buying Diet Mountain Dew. So the impact that the firm had, what Mountain Dew had ended up doing, was they worked with the distributor for these particular hot dogs and had every time you buy one hot dog, or excuse me, every time you buy a Mountain Dew, you get a free hot dog, right? So it incentivizes both of them. So they worked out the finances on the back end, of course, but that drove business. So that's one way we look at these analytics. From a supply chain standpoint, what we're looking to do with the analytics, we want to reduce inventory holding costs. So any major producer, obviously they're going to have various different stages of inventory, raw materials, work in progress, finished goods. But what they don't want is those finished goods just sitting in the stores. We want to churn and burn. We want to increase the cash to conversion cycles. We want to get money back into the supply chain to continue to do it. So we want to free up the cash that we have on hand. We don't want to tie it in fixed assets and inventory. Analytics can help us understand the demand so as to be able to correctly allocate where the inventory is going. We want to increase forecast accuracy, which is one of the components we're going to discuss today, vitally important in the reverse supply chain, because we need to know how much of what may come back. And then, of course, from the forward perspective, we're considering the reverse as well, considering freight utilization and loading, maximizing tons per mile, maximizing the transportation economics that exist behind what we're doing. So now we're going to consider an industry example, Walmart. Everybody knows Walmart. They're the largest retailer in the world, but when you think about the individual store level data, it gets really interesting. So a typical Walmart store has about 150,000 stock keeping units at any given time. That's distinct products that they offer. Remarkable, right? Well, when you consider Walmart.com, 5 million stock keeping units. Now, of course, a large portion of those are contractual agreements where if an order goes through Walmart.com, they pass along the order information to the vendor, but a large chunk of those are still Walmart's own SKUs. Now, when you think about the size of Walmart, everyone throws out their, the largest number of employer in the world and largest retail shop. They have 11,495 locations globally, almost half of which are just in the United States. So it's a staggering statistic. The next one is even more so. Nearly 140 million customers served each week. That's incredible, right? So big data has been such a big impact to Walmart that they can't basically do anything without going through a stage gating process. It's this important. It's been this profitable to them. So as an example, the analytics program actually in Walmart is under the CFO. It's under the finance division. And it's down to a science where they can't even change an internet search algorithm or a Google AdWords without the approval from the CEO. And the reason why they do this is because it's so calculated and so carefully planned out. An example was Cake Pops a couple years back. Everybody wanted Cake Pops and everybody was making Cake Pops. There actually was these guys on Shark Tank, if you ever watched the show, and they sold Cake Pops. They had I think it was a 25% stake for $250,000. So $1 million business all on little balls of cake. So Walmart saw this on social media. They saw it on various other places on the internet, and they were able to quickly get them in stores because they used predictive algorithms to see and to gather the data. An example might be RSS feeds. You can write predictive algorithms to gather what's happening on the RSS feeds, use that as kind of market pulse information, and then act on it. Now consider again Walmart, but from the perspective of reverse logistics. So all those numbers that we gave you, we're going to keep those in the front of our mind. Assume that every customer that comes through, the average basket size, so the total value of their goods, was $30. And that's probably reasonable depending on the time. Granted, you've got people buying large televisions, but you also get people buying groceries and such. Now, we said before that there was 140 million customers per week. Just assume for the moment that 0.01% of those 140 million customers returned one product whose average value is $5, let's just say. Now, we're really ballparking it here, but that's 14,000 returns at $5 each. That's $70,000 of product going back into the return chain per week. Now, these are numbers that I literally just plucked out of the air for illustrative purposes, but it's probably larger than this. So the question that you have to ask yourself, what do we do with that 70,000? And now, of course, at this point in the course, you've seen how we can take inventory, how we can turn it into money, how we can figure out how to repurpose it or the best way in which to bring it through our reverse supply chain. But what can analytics do to help manage this process? The most fundamental thing, we have to go back to a couple lectures ago, is that you have to understand why returns occur. You know, it's staggering that before returns management was considered an asset or a strategic element to the firm, they were just returns. They were a nuisance. We had to figure out how do we just get rid of them. But then when you just take an example, you look at the table on the left there, why did the returns come back? 20% of them were defective. Okay, so that right there tells you something. That tells you 1 in 5, there's something wrong with it, right? Then the other 4 out of 5, well, for whatever reason we couldn't install them or there was performance and so on and so forth. But that's the most fundamental beginning to an analytics program in the reverse supply chain. Then you move on and you further break down the defective versus non-defective, right? So there was a failure in the product, there was shipping damage and so on and so forth. The question then you have to ask, and these are just examples, and again, before I continue, what I do want to mention is that the following is just going to cover a scratching the surface of what the analytics is. There are literally degrees in analytics, so I'm going to give you a big picture on what those analytics are with respect to reverse supply chains, but keep that in mind. So, with that said, once we have an understanding of defective versus not, or we understand a categorization of why they're coming back, then we can delve even deeper and figure out what went wrong. And typically, if you've studied lean management or quality management systems, used to be really popular, total quality management. It's gone through several different iterations. But a root cause analysis is the easiest way to start diagnosing things. And the important part of it, and this has been discussed previously, but it starts with training. So because you need information gathering at the retailer to understand why the customer is returning the product. Now, of course, B2B, you'd also need your customer service rep or your sales manager to figure out what exactly went wrong with the product. The idea is that you need trained store clerks to accurately record customer information. You know, the example that I use sometimes is, I think Target has this down pretty well. When you walk in and to return a product, they simply ask you what went wrong or why you're returning the product. And you can give them a whole host of reasons, of course, but if it's defective, they put it into a bin. And I think if it's reusable, they put it into a separate bin. That's such a fundamental way to understand it, but it can significantly improve how well you know and how and what to do with the product. And so, you know, analyzing data, one of the quotes from a recent article that I read and subsequently passing on to you, analyzing this data on why customers return goods, it helps you understand A, what the faults were, but B, how we can reduce those costs. And so information sharing is vitally important. So when we tackle back to the ERP integration analytics discussion, now that systems are integrated, now that we have so many stakeholders, gathering this information becomes a lot easier and, conversely or subsequently, more important. So consider the Toyota example that we discussed in a previous lecture. Toyota had several issues going on, and it seemed as though they were going on all at once. They had a brake issue with a lot of their Lexus models. They had a steering issue, and they had a sticking pedal issue. Well, the process that they went through initially, and actually these management systems that deal with root cause analysis actually originated from Japanese management training. But they went through kind of an interesting iteration, right? They first said, oh no, it was the floor mats. And then it was the position of the floor mats relative to the ignition, it was the position of the floor mats relative to the accelerator pedal, and so on and so forth. And finally, they were able to diagnose what went wrong. Well, the interesting thing here is that if it's a company surrounded on quality, from the customer's perspective, if you're perceived as you're covering something up versus if you're actually fixing the problem, think about the goodwill in the customer's mind. So again, to recap what I'm saying here, the basic understanding goes a very long way in order for you to understand why and how, and then subsequently how to fix it. Because these diagnostics become so important. So consider why the returns come back. In the case of defective products, ask fundamental questions. What was defective about it? You know, obviously you're going to have situations where the customer said, oh, it's broken, and it was perfectly fine. But if you see that a component's missing, if you see that the screen doesn't work, and so on and so forth, okay? What it can tell you, if you have a common theme reoccurring in a particular product, A, that may signal to you that a recall might be coming, right? Because we have, a lot of the same issues coming back. Or you might have to go back to manufacturing or engineering and go to the drawing board and see what exactly design problems existed. How can we fix those? For convenience and performance, now it gets a little bit more nebulous, but still you can gather information. Was the marketing research interpreted incorrectly? Was there a disconnect between what we thought the customer wanted and what the product had? What went wrong there, right? Could not install. Very basic. Were the instructions sufficient? I'm sure we've all had the issue where you get a stack like this to install a nightstand, and you're sitting there reading and corresponding all these things. At a certain point, if you can't install it, I would think a customer would just say, I'll try a different product, right? And you don't want that as a manufacturer, obviously. So these diagnostics, very simple, very important. Here's an example from industry that they did exactly this. Estee Lauder. So their whole goal was, how do we figure out how to reduce these cosmetic returns? Because a lot of the time, it's difficult to reuse some of this product. It's very difficult to take an expired chemical and put it back into the reverse supply chain. You might be able to salvage packaging or something like that, but anyway, they wanted to reduce production inventory levels through taking those returned goods wherever possible and putting them back on the market. So we have these assets, we've already sold them, they came back in the supply chain. Rather than dispose of them, let's figure out how to make money back from them. So what they were able to do by designing a lot of these basic fundamental programs, understanding what the root cause to the problem was, why the returns were coming back, very simple things like this at a basic analytics level, they were able to evaluate 24% more return products, redistribute 1.5 times many products of those returns that they previously had, and reduce the amount of products that were getting destroyed from 37% to 27%. And to top it all off, aside from the production and inventory costs, as well as the profits gained by reincorporating returned product back into the supply chain, they were able to save $500,000 in labor costs alone. So there's a cost savings and there's a profit gain aspect to this, and a basic fundamental understanding to this helped Estee Lauder do it. In fact, if you read the article, which the citation's towards the end, they actually thought about spinning this off into a consulting firm to do this for other firms. It was so successful. As another example, this is more related to the recycling component of reverse logistics, but in Brazil there's a plant that is essentially entirely technologically integrated. And their goal is, or rather their impetus is, that they have an integrated ecosystem for electronic products where they process 100 tons of discarded equipment per month. The goal is to extract as much value possible from the product. But the interesting thing in the analytics tie into this is that they leverage technology, particularly RFID and ERP technologies, in order to diagnose it very quickly. So what they do, printers is a big component, and they're actually, when you read the article, you'll see this particular recycling plant is built right next to Flextronics manufacturer in Brazil. So anytime something comes back to the manufacturer, they basically walk it next door. But the process is, when these return printers come in, if they're RFID'd up, then it's identified to see what the make and model number is. You just take a quick scan, you can gather that. That subsequently tells you the material composition of the product, the internal components of the product. So right there, you know what the assembly time is going to be because you know what the guts of the product are, and then you have a better understanding on what can be salvaged and what can't. So this reduces time in terms of diagnostics, because otherwise you'd have to do chemical testing in a lab, right, to understand, to identify what the chemical composition of whatever the material is. But it also facilitates disassembly. And so then once they have the product disassembled, the metals, iron, copper, steel, they're sent off to specialists who mine and sell and deal with those. But then the plant itself recovers all the plastics from the return components, which they go right back to Flextronics, and it's built right into that whole forward supply chain again. So analytics in this context, not only does it facilitate efficiencies in the sense of technology, allowing us to reduce the time it takes as well as increase the visibility on what exactly it is that we're going to be doing, it also helps them to adhere to regulatory burdens. So the Brazilian government laid down standards for this particular industry. They leverage analytics and technology as a verifiable mechanism to justify what they're doing, so if they ever get audited, it's very simple. So that's another angle on analytics. It's the whole integration of technology, ERP, and so on and so forth, allowing that data to come in and enhance our reverse and forward supply chain processes. So, big picture on analytics, leveraging information to make better decisions, right? And predominantly what we've discussed now is, why are their returns coming back? That's one hand. On the other hand, what we have to understand is how much is going to come back, not just why. So we understand why, now we need to figure out how much. The easiest way to do this, and again, I'm scratching the surface on these forecasting methodologies. Send me an email if any of you are interested in getting more deeply into the ones we're going to spend a bit more time on. A little bit outside the scope of the course, but very, very important, and we can certainly discuss them. There's been a transition, interestingly, with the influence of analytics, I guess you could say. It used to be, let's just do some averages. Let's look at a basic average, or maybe get a little bit more complicated where we do a moving average every 4 months, some type of quarterly, seasonal. Maybe I'll have a weighted moving average, but this is sort of a rudimentary way to look at it. As you transition into the more sophisticated techniques, the first is exponential smoothing. Exponential smoothing allows us to weight information of a recent period and help predict the future based on the more recent time periods. Then you can even go one step further where if you're in an industry where you see typically seasonality, or there's a huge growth in the industry, so you see a trend, you want to take that into account. For example, if you're in the consumer goods space, there's no doubt that during the holiday season, on the forward end, you're going to see a ramp up in sales. And then on the reverse end, you're going to see an increase in returns right after Christmas. So if you know the seasonal patterns coming, you leverage something called the Holton-Winters method. It's exponential smoothing taken to the next level where you have a trend and you have a seasonal component. Then now probably the pinnacle of what a lot of analytics and data mining ends up doing is leveraging Bayesian inference. So Bayesian statistics in general, from an econometric standpoint, allows for the researcher to get individual level betas. So if you have multiple units, you can get specific and distinct individual level behavior data from your analysis. In our context, in the forecasting context, you have to assume a priori what the distribution is going to look like. It gives you a little bit more flexibility because you're not making the assumptions that you would with, let's say, a basic linear regression, but what you're doing is a priori assuming the distribution, having a holdout, leveraging the information that comes in to continuously update. So you have an empirical distribution function that gets constantly updated, and the benefit to it is the probabilistic approach. So Bayesian essentially is a very sophisticated way to say we maybe think what this is. Now, obviously I boiled that down to one sentence, but very, very practical and very useful if done correctly. The only the caveat that I would say is that the assumptions that are made into what that a priori distribution is have to be done very carefully. These are all techniques to help us figure out how to do it, but who's actually doing it? Well, T-Mobile, interestingly enough. So this article came off Supply Chain Brain, and it's pretty interesting when you think about, because when you look at the landscape out there, at least as of July 31st when I'm recording this, the big 4 or 5 in the mobile industry, you've got Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, and then T-Mobile. Most statistics put T-Mobile at either 3 or 4, depending. So they're not necessarily the big guy, but this is an example of how they're leveraging both reverse logistics and analytics to be able to increase profits, right? So their statistics, their basic snapshot is that they have about 43 million wireless subscribers, and they have 2 centralized distribution centers, one in Texas for returns and another in Kentucky for forward replenishment. So you've got the forward chain in Kentucky, you've got the return chain in Texas. These are actually outsourced through Ingram Micro, interestingly enough. But they have a forward and reverse strategy, particularly when you think about the business that they're in. It makes a lot of sense to dedicate, right? So in 2013 fiscal year, 5.2 million handsets came back through that returns facility, okay? Now, of several different reasons. In some cases, it was warranty repairs, which is kind of a unique way, as we talked about in previous lectures, to deal with returns, because the onus is directly on you to pull it and place it, fix it, send it back, right? But then, of course, there's other issues such as insurance, recycling because they upgraded to a new phone, or buyer's remorse. The most difficult one to handle, probably buyer's remorse in some cases, because it's a used product that was barely used. So they're dealing with issues of varying product quality, sometimes damaged packaging, that can be a reason for it being defective, and uncertain pricing. They don't know how much we're going to sell it for, what can we salvage it, and so on. So when you look at all of them, that whole buyer's remorse category, I guess you could say, 66% of them, no trouble found. This is a big deal of that 5.2 million. That's substantial, right? What they did, they went to SAP, so again, integrating this whole ERP modular integrated systems. They went to SAP's Advanced Planning and Optimization tool. And essentially what it does is for each specific channel in which it operates, it analyzes the returns. And it leverages a combination of all those forecasting methodologies that we looked at to understand what's going to come back. The issue and the difficulty, which is not necessarily SAP's fault, is that this is a very fragmented industry in terms of volume of sales. So consider, for example, your local mom and pop wireless shop versus Walmart, right? They're not going to get 140 million people walking past their store like Walmart does. So you have fragmented patterns of returns and frequencies, and they've achieved moderate success by doing this. So they 72% forecast accuracy with a 45-day lag. Well, when you look at forecast accuracy under any other circumstance, that wouldn't be good. But consider the improvement that 72% forecast accuracy is over basically throwing a dart up against the wall and seeing, hey, how much is going to come this day? Okay, so this is very important. This is a huge improvement. And another thing they did to tie it back to integrating the supply chain stakeholders was they used CPFR, Collaborative Planning, Forecasting, and Replenishment. They brought in the suppliers, they brought in the retailers, and they had a collaborative discussion. So they had increased information, which can only improve the forecasts, right? Because then you kind of decrease the issues that arise because of this fragmentation. And so the net of it all is that of those 5.3 million units returned, they were able to take 4.5 million of them and put them back in the reverse chain. So that's 86% of the returns they were able to salvage some value from. Consider how different that would be if they just let it happen, right? So that's the idea. Analytics in several different components, vitally important to the reverse and forward supply chain. So the biggest takeaways I want you to have here are analytics in general has transitioned into a vital component of supply chains, and it'll only get bigger. On the reverse side, we're still kind of scratching the surface to figure out how we can do this, but it can only further improve performance. It's pretty much a win-win, however you look at it. It generates cost savings and it increases material usage. The T-Mobile and Estee Lauder examples, perfect way to look at that. So my questions to you to kind of think about as you've watched this, there's so many different forecast methodologies that work really well in the forward supply chain. Why do you think it's so difficult in the reverse channel? Why is that? Then, what are the major challenges to reverse logistics forecasting in general? So not just with the methodology, why is it so difficult? It's a fundamental question, but it's really difficult to answer, I think. But if you have any questions, email me, and I'll see you next week.